Hey out there, today is Monday, October 24th, 2022. Coming up on the show today, from the new book, Making the Cut at Pixar, author Bill Kinder.
That was the missing ingredient that Pixar really needed. Pixar had been built by animators who revered the Disney tradition, but there really wasn't an editorial tradition at Disney for lots of reasons, technical and otherwise.
And author Bobbie Osteen.
What's beautiful about Pixar is that it's not linear. So in live action, it's a pipeline. Editing is the final stage. In animation, the edit suite is the hub of the wheel. So everything comes in and out of the edit suite throughout the production.
Yes, all that and more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Well, hey there. Happy October 24th. Next Monday you get Happy Halloween, but today you get Happy October 24th. I'm sure it's a holiday somewhere. Why don't we make it International Podcast Book Club Day? Because today we're talking about a book, which is something we have not done in a long time. So not only are we overdue for a little book club action here on the podcast, but we'll be talking about a pretty important book in the world of film editing and about the role of the editor in feature animation. The book is called Making the Cut at Pixar from authors Bill Kinder and Bobbie Osteen. Now, Bobbie's name is probably familiar to many of you because if you're listening to this podcast, you probably avail yourself of any info about the career of editing that you can. And Bobbie has not only written 2 books already on the topic, The Invisible Cut and Cut to the Chase, but she can often be found hosting panels and interviews with editors. So in all likelihood, you've enjoyed her books and her interviews with editors already. And as far as Bill Kinder goes, he really brings the insider perspective on the revolution that took place at Pixar as he was their director of editorial and post-production from 1996 to 2014, which is quite a run and covers a lot of ground with the films Pixar released on the heels of Toy Story, which, as you know, was the film that really changed the game for how the industry would look at the post-process for animated features. These are big topics, and it is a book filled with big info. On top of that, it is loaded with video content that you get access to as well. So really, it's a full-on multimedia experience that will educate and entertain you about the past, present, and insight into the possible future of editing and animation and beyond. So as you can tell, there is lots to talk about with Bobbie and Bill. And also a few things to talk about with Rough Cut sponsor Extreme Music. No, they don't write books, they write music. Well, they have people that write it for them. But they take that music and they give it to you in the form of incredible production audio that you can use to help your next film or TV project sound awesome. They have a massive catalog of tracks created by top-shelf musicians and composers like past Rough Cut guests Michael Giacchino and Hans Zimmer. Got to get those guys on at the same time someday. That would be epic. And epic is a word you could search on when you're exploring the Extreme Music catalog. Things like tempo, genre, beats per minute, lyrics. You can search on all those things, or you can upload a track of your own so that Extreme Music can find you ones like it. No matter which way you go, you can then customize those tracks for length and instrumentation to suit your needs to a T. You can do the licensing right there on their website, or if you need a little help, talk to one of their living, breathing reps, stay away from the dead ones, at an office in your neck of the woods. So, dear listener, the next time you have a story to tell, put it to music with the best in production audio from our friends and sponsor, Extreme Music. Now then, book club has started. The book is Making the Cut at Pixar. The authors, Bobbie Osteen and Bill Kinder. There's so much to cover here. Animation is such a big topic, and I often get lost myself. So, I mean, that's one of the great things about your book, is it helps people like me that can't navigate the world of animation too easily on their own. So I thought we would start with the origins of the book itself. And how was it that both of you came together to collaborate on it?
I worked at Pixar for many years, working with the editors there. And after giving some talks at film schools at the urging of Ed Catmull, I began to realize, based on the reflection of responses I got from the students, that this was surprising information, this was unknown information, and this was fascinating information. And I thought, I could elaborate on this. I could explain more of this. And so I thought it would be a good idea to try to set it down in a book. And then I met Bobbie Osteen. We should do like the parallel action cut, Bobbie. Meanwhile, Bobbie.
Back at the other cutting room. So I had been interviewing and writing about live action editors for years. And I had the same misconception about animation that many people have, which is that, oh, it's a piece of cake. They just cut the heads and tails off the shots and drop them in. Well, it couldn't be further from the truth. And I was blown away by the level of involvement that animation has in every aspect of production, to the degree that they're really shaping the story and helping create the story from the beginning. They're the writers from the beginning rather than the final writers, which is true of live action. So I ended up visiting Pixar and meeting two editors and actually doing events with them, Nick Smith and Ken Schretzman. And I just always think editors are underappreciated and misunderstood. And this is times 100. So I was really wanted to shine the light on animation editors. And the other thing, which Bill and I, when we finally met, we had this wonderful sort of yin-yang relationship, because we both brought such different things to the project, but also we knew the importance of show and tell, because editing is so elusive, it's so instinctual, it's so rhythmic, it's so visceral, it's all those things. And with live action, you really can't do it. You can I would show sequences and the editors would deconstruct challenges and solutions and problems and everything. And they would pick something that would engender that conversation. But you can't show before and after. You can't show dailies, and even if you could, it's not the same. And so I realized like storyboards and the early layout to a degree too, but particularly storyboards were incredibly interesting to show different stages of storyboards to final, the editor facing this void of sonic void and a blank slate with rough drawings and creating these compelling sequences. And it never gets seen by the public, storyboards never get seen. And they're amazing. And it's the bedrock for the entire movie. So anyway, I ended up meeting Lee Unkrich, who is the hero origin story, which we'll get into. And he said, you should meet Bill Kinder because he has the same idea of writing a book. So yeah, then we got together and our passion was so aligned. But as I said, Bill had this inside knowledge that was so helpful and illuminating. And so our different ways of using language to communicate concepts, working through that together, which is really challenging. So anybody could understand, was the basis for our book. And then Bill if you can talk about like your access to the archives, which was amazing.
Sure. Yeah, it's true. I mean, the serendipity of us connecting over this project is that we did both have this show and tell idea. I knew from presenting materials, work in progress stuff at these film school talks that was always the most interesting stuff, because like Bobbie says, no one ever gets to see the story reel phase of this stuff. And that's really where so many of the creative decisions are made. And thanks to Pixar, we had access to a trove of hidden treasures in their vault to share what all these great films look like in that editorial stage, and really go through it in depth. I was lucky enough to work on some of the early DVDs back when we had physical media with A Bug's Life, Monsters, Inc., Toy Story 2, etc. And we always endeavored to present the editing process. And all we could do to that broad audience was show a before and after synchronized, like a split screen, which really is an approximation of the process from 30,000 feet. But there's so much more to it if you really want to know what's happening and what kind of decisions are being made. So I feel like we finally got to it. This book is all those years of trying to figure out how to present that material. And I had this collaborator in Bobbie to, help make sure that the way it was being presented was clear to any audience, whether you're someone who is in the industry and editing already, or you're a Pixar fan. We want this book to be accessible. And so far we're told that, it is. People are enjoying reading it and getting something out of it.
I certainly enjoyed it. And I believe you both use the term show and tell. And that's something I want to impress upon anybody listening, is that, yes, it's a book, but it's almost sort of more of a multimedia experience, which is a wonderful thing, a wonderful way of presenting this information, because as you've both pointed out, there are concepts that are best introduced or at least reinforced with videos, which you have access to in this book. And so that's a whole other project in and of itself. I'm very curious about what came first, the videos or the book? Was it just sort of an integrated process? Did one inform the other? How did you approach that aspect of doing this big project?
Well, it started with the interviews. We just interviewed everyone we could at Pixar. And, we had ideas about concepts but then, that sort of precipitated a shape, like what about dialogue do we want to talk? We break it down, storyboards, dialogue, layout, which is camera, even the culture of Pixar, the origin story of Pixar, all of this, and also just the psychology of working in animation and what the pressures on the editor. So all these things were in our minds, and then the videos, which we often call case studies. Speaking of show and tell, because we would present a situation, maybe a sequence like Married Life, which is one of our favorites, and of course it's one of the most beloved montages in the history of cinema, went awry at one point, and so it's always about problems or challenges and solutions. That's how you explain a creative process. So that's why we would call them case studies. We have 90 minutes of video content. We have over 40 segments. And I also just want to say, in case I forget later, this is the very first book that's ever been written about the animation editor.
I think it's got to be one of the very few books that also talks about editing with this multimedia or intermedia approach. I can't imagine reading a book about how films are made and creative process without something like this now. It just seems so retro to look at the outgoing frame of the last shot and the incoming frame of the new shot on a still thumbnail, black and white in bad print. It's just like,
that's what I did in my previous book.
Yeah, it's just, that's what we had for decades, but it's just not filmmaking. Editing happens in time, and you have to hear it and see it at 24 FPS. That's it. And so, it wasn't easy. We got a lot of blank stares when we said, we got this great idea. We're going to have clips to illustrate what we're talking about. And book publishers publish books. They don't publish video. So but we found a great publisher in Focal Press. So away we go. And we're really proud of how all that worked out and how you can follow along the text and then take a look at what the people in the book are talking about, what we're writing about. And we were urged to give the readers some historical context. And I think it really does deepen the book and the sense of where in film history we're situating all this in a way that wasn't easy. And I think maybe that was one reason it wasn't there to begin with, is because, as we said earlier, there are no books written about editing animation. So we really had to dig. We went to the Margaret Herrick Library and trolled the stacks for one-of-a-kind documents that are interviews of people back in the days of the Disney Studios golden age. We tore through every single book we could find about that era and pieced together a way to situate, okay, things were like this up to this point, and then something happened. And I really think that contrast helps illuminate the theme of the book.
We wanted to start with the origin story of Pixar, the culture of Pixar, and Lee showing up and getting hired because he was an avid expert. Little did they know he had this cinematic knowledge and this incredible serendipitous origin. But then we didn't know how to present what Bill is talking about, giving the reader context for this is the way it used to be and this is how it's different, and try to explain how the editor ended up being at the center when in the old days they were called cutters and they were clerical. They had no creative role. So how do you don't want to start like that because it's not that exciting, and it's not like the narrative force of Lee showing up and all that. So we figured out how to do it as a rewind And that took some time just to get distance on it, you know. And as far as how the videos were created, I also want to say, when I said we started with interviews, they were all filmed. So it wasn't just audio. So that was part of the shape of a lot of those pieces. Those little video segments are editors talking about their work, and then you see their work or they talk over their work.
Well, since we've mentioned him a couple times now, I should just jump right ahead to that question, and I'll read it verbatim the way I wrote it. If this book were a movie, at least a narrative movie, I think the protagonist, or at least the first person we would meet, is a character named, quote, Lee. Tell me about Lee and why he is so crucial to this story.
Well, let's see. Lee answered the problem that Pixar was having when they were working on Toy Story and had all kinds of growing pains launching the first CGI feature film. They had committed to working on an Avid against the advice of their production partner, the Disney studio, which said, we don't do that. You need to show everything on film. And of course, as you see in the book, film is the last step. They don't film things out just for fun. That's the end result of all the rendering and everything. So Pixar had the right idea that that would be the end step. We're going to turn this whole thing kind of on its head and work digitally and video, back in the day, standard def video, and screen tapes, and you'll take it or not. And so they stood by that. But then they had a problem because the Avid was so new. It had been used on some independent feature films, some kind of lesser known titles that took the chance early on, but it wasn't the given that it is today. And so they had some problems identifying someone who could really operate and jam, if you will, on the instrument of the Avid. So they turned to the company Avid itself and said, who in the greater LA area do you have who is expert with this thing? Because we're kind of going through our list up here in Northern California, where Pixar is based, and striking out, not finding the fit, if you will. And the person who received that call decided to go in backwards order on their alphabetical list. And so they found Unkrich with a U at the bottom and said, how about this guy, Lee Unkrich? And so the amazing chance of that, I think we've used serendipity a few times already, but it's just incredible luck that they found Lee. Not only was he a proud, avid, early adopter, but he had been to film school and knew the history of film very well, had studied great directors. He's a huge Stanley Kubrick fan. He's got an amazing book coming out shortly about Kubrick. And he had directed live action television already. So he understood filmmaking from that point of view, knew very little about animation. And it turns out that was the missing ingredient that Pixar really needed. Pixar had been built by animators who revered the Disney tradition, but there really wasn't an editorial tradition at Disney for lots of reasons, technical and otherwise. But Lee arrived and said, okay, we're doing animation. I want to study animation. I'm going to look at all the great animation that's done. And then he realized as he was pursuing this, that in fact, this was a different ballgame. CGI has a camera with a lens that has a focal length, just like a live action film. And so why not use all of those aspects of our visual storytelling language and all the things that cue us to seeing a live action film as classical Hollywood narrative, as opposed to the traditions that came out of animation, which were largely out of the constraints that they faced working in two dimensions. Lee really kind of blew open the possibilities by saying, wait, we don't have to decide everything in a drawing on a storyboard. We get a chance to scout a location with a camera once we've built that location and we have characters to put in it. Then we can think like live action directors and direct this thing.
And I think a lot of the technology had to sort of catch up with their ambitions. They were sort of putting it together it was to do Toy Story, the the degree of ambition and the technology sort of catching up to it, Lee was the perfect person for that. But the other thing is, all the people in the Brain Trust, that original group of animators, they hadn't learned, animation wasn't taught at editing wasn't taught at CalArts, or or anything having to do with cinema or camera coverage. And in fact, the early Pixar shorts, you can see that they didn't understand anything about that. They cross a line at one point, and some of them are just proscenium, shots that didn't even need to know it. So, and the culture was very open. They were not threatened by this person who had knowledge that they didn't have. They were really eager to embrace Lee's knowledge, so that fertile ground was there. And then you had this thing that we talk about too, which is that Pixar was not in Hollywood. So there was sort of a freedom that they had to create this innovative world that was very conducive to this, this fertile ground and this growth and this incredible success they had right out of the gate with Toy Story. And what we haven't really specifically talked about as well is this idea of digital editing. One of the reasons why the editor was so limited in his role is because editing was destructive. You couldn't just try a million things. The flexibility of digital editing, the Avid, allowed for the editor to become central. That was really the origin of how the editor got to be involved, the nature of the production, but also the medium and the ability to manipulate. I mean, when you're dealing at the early stages of the storyboards and you have pictures not tied to sound, and you have this incredible freedom to manipulate performances down to phonemes, just microscopic manipulation that the audience will never see. That would not happen without digital editing. So that was a huge part of it, that just as it was taking off, this was all happening.
Also, imagine Lee's realization coming from live action, where you can't edit the dialogue that wildly. You're stuck, on someone's face for the length of a shot. Yes, you can cheat when you cut away, but you can only cut away, every few seconds. And it has to make emotional sense. But in animation, there's no picture that you are stuck with. You're not tied to it. The picture comes later. The sound is first. The sound is the bedrock, and the editor is going to create that. So imagine his recognition, like, wait a minute, I'm not constrained here at all. I can go down to, as Bobbie says, the phoneme. That's how close up he was getting to these performances to create these emotional moments out of months and months of dialogue recording sessions done with these great actors.
And Joe Ramp, who was one of the original Brain Trust people, he early on, Lee edited a sequence, and he's creating this sonic world with not even room tone, nothing, and that he created this mood and it's emotion with with raindrops and a little, and effects. And even, we talk about vocalizations in our book because it's something you don't think about. For one thing, the actors are not interacting in real time. So you have to create that action in the storyboard stage. And there's no geography, of course, but you also just weird things like they have a collection of nose size at Pixar. Like, what is a note? It's just these weird little things in between the words that are just on a set would just be there. And Lee was able to recreate that and create a cinematic movie-like soundscape without having anything that's actually real.
Well, it's so hard not to go on tangents in this discussion because there's so many different threads to pull, branches to go down with this medium. One of the things I remember in the book that really stood out to me is the difference between, in dialogue editing, the difference between something being believable and realistic. We're not trying to make this talking fish real. We're trying to get the audience to believe in the talking fish. And just the importance of being a good dialogue editor. And as you said, down to the phoneme, down to the breath.
Totally. I remember early on, live action editors coming to help us out and just being boggled by the number of soundtracks and the detail in the soundtrack, because they're used to what they call an A track. It's the production track, put it down, and then maybe, slap some music in there and an effect, a gunshot or whatever. But this was going crazy, and it just, people lost their mind. They said, I just can't do this. I'm a picture editor. I'm out. Fair enough. It's a different sensibility. The other thing that comes to mind is the way that people speak and the tone of our voices when we have emotion is something so critical for any editor, sound, picture, documentary, narrative, animation, to listen to. There's a wonderful part in the book where Ken Schretzman talks about listening to the radio. And he can tell in a millisecond if one of the actors that he's been working with is being interviewed on the radio. He knows those voices so well. He can also detect when something has been edited. And I noticed that I became sensitive to this too. I just feel like there's so much bad editing out there in terms of just slapping together two lines of dialogue and covering over the cut with a cutaway. And you go, well, wait, if I'm just listening to that, you've just stripped my gears. That doesn't work. So that's what these editors are doing when they talk about creating a believable performance, is something that, after years of tuning their ears to these characters and just the nature of human conversation, they have a sensibility. It's pretty intangible, I don't know if there's a rule book for this, but it's a sensibility that they develop in practice, and they are able to apply that in creating these believable performances.
One of the risks of working in animation, not really understanding what Bill was just talking about, was taking too much air out of it. David Ian Salter was talking about in Finding Nemo, this sort of rapid fire, sort of 40s witty dialogue, and suddenly you lose the emotion. So you have to really be careful about that too. It's just a very, and as is true of all editing, and animation editors say this as well, watch films, watch animated movies, watch great movies, watch why does this work? How is the editor shaping these scenes to create this emotional impact, or humor too? Everything's about timing, and it's human timing, even if it's fish, because it's human emotion.
Just for historical context, I mean, Bobbie, you were talking about the short films that were being done at Pixar and the limitations with those. What was the initial vision of Pixar prior to the debut of Toy Story? When that company was founded, what was the mission statement? What were they going after?
It's such a great secret history that we cover in the book. Ed Catmull, the godfather of computer animation, as he's known, had this dream from the moment that he animated a model of his hand back in the 1970s using a computer to make the first computer animated film. So he navigated relentlessly some insane technical and business stormy seas to bring that vision to life. And he started by, almost infiltrating, if you will, Industrial Light and Magic, Lucasfilm empire, to run the computer division there, which I think George Lucas had in mind that computers would have something to do with the future of filmmaking back in the 1980s. And he had a three-prong approach of R&D for sound, digital sound, using digital sound for film, using digital picture for editing, hence the Editroid, and visual effects, creating imagery with computers. And so this computer division did a very small group, a renegade group, if you want to picture it that way, created some great visual effects shots in films from that period, Sherlock Holmes, Star Trek. They're just brief moments, but they were revolutionary because they were made with a computer. So Ed Catmull is going along doing this work with this secret idea to hatch the first computer animated film. he hires an animator from Disney, but his charter wasn't to make animation. So he gave that person the title of something like interface designer and snuck him in. This was John Lasseter, who, of course, went on to make Toy Story and some of the early short films. Andre and Wally B was made there at Lucasfilm, and later Luxo Jr., which is kind of the classic proscenium example that Bobbie referred to earlier, with no cuts, 0 edits. So, it was from there that Pixar spun off. Ed Catmull, again, was instrumental in convincing Steve Jobs, after several tries, to buy this computer division from George Lucas when George Lucas happened to need a little bit of money. And Steve bought into the idea. Steve Jobs was a great supporter of this vision for many, many years out of his own personal resources, as well as an incredible negotiator to get Disney on board with supporting and distributing the first computer animated film, Toy Story, and then creating a deal that allowed us to make many films with Disney after that. That's the kind of crazy serpentine long story short of how Pixar came to be.
Well, I don't want to just leave it at Pixar decided that we're going to go with digital editing to do this first CGI animated feature. We got this guy, Lee, he knows the Avid, problem solved. Certainly wasn't that simple. So what were some of the technical challenges that had to be overcome once Lee was on board? I'm assuming you probably still have a faction in there that's like, you know what, we have another idea about how to do this. So maybe there was just some internal roadblocks to overcome. And I'd just like to know a little bit more, as much as you care to share, about what were the problems we had to solve at Pixar to really make Toy Story work.
So many problems. Start with the audacity, the bravery of the producer of the film to say, we're committed to this thing. We're going to do this. And where did that come from? It came from this DNA that we just described of Lucasfilm and the Editorial. And, this cohort, these people were there, and then they came to Pixar. So they said, we know this. We know how to make cut lists with a computer and then match it back to film. We can do this. But of course, the Avid was new. They also were strapped. It was very, I said renegade earlier. It was scrappy. It was unknown. Skunkworks. Nobody knew what Pixar was at that point. So they couldn't afford, especially if they had no support from their production partner, they couldn't really afford the fancy 24 frame per second Avid. No. They had to buy the Media Composer, which worked at video speed, which we know is 30 frames per second. So how then would we make the cut list that when we have it filmed out is at 24 frames per second when we're starting at 30? If you ask Torben Bullock, who is a great editor of many Pixar films and was film assistant at the time, having to conform these film reels, these shots of film, I should say, that came out of the camera to these cut lists, and then update them and revise them when there were changes. He can tell you how, in great detail, hair splitting and hair pulling the effort was, because the cut lists weren't frame accurate. So that was one nightmare that was overcome with just brute strength and will. Another difficulty was just the technology at the time, right? So I remember my big challenge, I got there right after Toy Story. We wanted to commit to this Avid system on A Bug's Life, and I wanted to buy a little bit more storage. How much did 9 gigabytes cost in 1998? Something like, $3,000. It was big budget decision. Sharing the media on multiple Avids as we scaled up was also very cutting edge at that time. Now, of course, it's normal. And then the other thing that really gets back to animation editing as an editorial problem to solve in general is what Avid calls media objects. The number of media objects that we had online at any given time with all of these iterations of the film, from storyboards to scratch recordings of every line with multiple takes to actual professional actors recording every line, multiple takes. Now you have rough layout, multiple takes. Now you have rough animation, multiple takes, rough effects, multiple takes, rough lighting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A huge, enormous number of files coming into this little system. And we would call, sometimes it would fail, and we would call. We had good support from Avid. And they would ask their standard questions. So we all know, have you rebooted, et cetera, et cetera. But they would also, their next question would be, how many media objects? Please check for us. How many media objects do you currently have online? And we would read them the number, and it would just blow their mind. They would say, oh, well, the system is not designed to support that number of hundreds of thousands. I forget what the number was, but it was astronomical compared to any number of files that a live action feature film or even a giant documentary would ever create, which tells you something about the scope of the editorial process in animation that we're trying to describe in the book. So that was certainly one of the chief challenges, just the load that we were putting on the system.
It's an important point that you both make about a significant aspect of this as being outside of Hollywood. Because in Hollywood, it's always nobody wants to be first. They want somebody else to have a hit with something and then follow on real quickly after that. So once Toy Story had the impact that it had, were there any appreciable changes in what people were looking for when they're staffing up if you're doing an animated film?
I would say Pixar was very lucky and self-conscious about being away from Hollywood. They reveled in the outsiderness. They knew they were doing something different. We were doing something different. And I remember Glenn McQueen, great animator at Pixar, saying, we're playing poker and we know we've got a royal flush. And nobody else at the table knows this. And I cannot wait to put these cards down. We knew that something was happening. We also knew that the films had problems. Every one of them was challenging. But that outsider status, I think, drove a lot of us. Maybe we were a collection of misfit toys by definition, because what were we doing in Northern California? And if we were making feature films, why weren't we in Los Angeles as a collective group? And I remember, talking to folks at Disney, talking to folks at Technicolor, the lab that we used to get our film printed, and just realizing that they really had no idea what we were up to and where all this was going. But we all knew that this was going to evolve this way somehow. And this is very much, we talk about it in the book, trying to get our hands around what is it about a place? What is it about Northern California in this case, where you had George Lucas, you had Francis Coppola, you had Steve Jobs, you had Philo T. Farnsworth, who invented television. You had, this great kind of explosion. Edward Muybridge, did the first sequence of stills for Stanford back in the day up there. So why did all this happen in Northern California? I can't answer it, but there is something culturally about it that was free from the industry practice of Hollywood, which was very organized, and there were certain ways to do things. And people who were successful in Hollywood were not going to risk what got them to be successful by taking a chance on some new digital thing.
I was asking about the ripple effect of, after Toy Story, how might things have changed in hiring practices and in processes for animated features. What about in live action? I mean, did Toy Story, did the things that Pixar accomplished in CGI have a ripple effect in live action in any way?
I mean, I wouldn't say necessarily, but I do think it's interesting to talk about how live action editors respond to working at Pixar. The culture, first of all, is very inclusive. You're not alone with a director in a room. There's a lot of people around you taking notes, and it's not private, which you have to get used to. But it's also, I think the ripple effect was over time. I mean, first of all, one of the things that's so interesting about the ultimate repercussions of our book is that the lines between live action animation, CGI, are blurring, because live action editors are becoming, I mean, there's a, first of all, a renaissance in animation right now anyway. There's so many platforms, there's so much, it's like an indie film world. But there's also live action editors are really interested now for their own careers because they're working with so much CGI heavy movies, but also there's so much digital manipulation. The Avid afforded that, intra-frame editing and animat and just manipulating the pace of a performance or just switching out performances. So it's sort of like they came together eventually. It wasn't specifically Toy Story, but it was the influence and the nature of the way cinema changed. And the other thing that's so interesting when you talk to live action editors, especially ones who've been doing it for many years, is, they had the same misconception that it was a piece of cake to edit live action animation. But also, as Nick Smith, who had been an editor for 30 years, live action, he said, the good news is you can do anything. The bad news is you can do anything. And this sort of overwhelming ability to do and that the amount of years that Pixar spends on story. And what a smart thing to do. Even if you're not ever going to do animation editing, what an inspiring thing to use the superpowers of the editors so fully in animation, where you are able to, where they can be on the ground when your story is being pitched and they're shaping these story reels. And what if a live action editor could be more involved in rehearsals and reading scripts, which they sometimes are, but they should be more of, or sitting on a set to some degree, or giving input on coverage. And the editors in animation have so much input. So that's a very inspiring thing. So it's the nature of intra-frame editing and the blurring of the lines, but it's also the creative inspiration. And, I think our goal for our book is not only to show people the world of animation, but also to inspire them about storytelling in cinema. And it's all the same. What's beautiful about Pixar is that it's not only that the editor is so involved, and by the way, we haven't mentioned a very crucial concept, which is that they're the hub of a wheel. It's not linear. So in live action, it's a pipeline. Editing is the final stage. In animation, the edit suite is the hub of the wheel. So everything comes in and out of the edit suite throughout the production.
In a book that's so much about change, the major phases of the animation process, story pitch, story reels, layout, animation, those still are basically what you build the film around. It's just the editor's role within those. As you said, Bobbie, they become the hub of everything. Something that stood out to me is in layout, and that layout credit has evolved to become DP in certain circumstances. How significant was that to change the fact that layout, now I'm getting a DP credit? And are there any other roles in post-production that might have changed titles in the same way because of this evolution or revolution in CGI animation?
Certainly the director of photography evolution was one of these examples of what we talked about earlier, of something that really shook people in traditional Hollywood circles. I remember I was so lucky to have a front row seat to this. I worked with the great Sharon Callahan, director of photography on many great Pixar films. And, her early credits have to do with lighting. She would design the lighting of the material. And I got to work with her as we would do the finishing of the deliverables of whether it was film or, I mentioned DVD earlier. We were doing mastering of projects for standard def video and later high def. And at the time, as digital cinema was coming along and presenting films digitally, I, meanwhile, had the opportunity to be on the technical committee of the American Society of Cinematographers. And that is an august group of great, talented folks who do traditional cinematography as we think of it. And I got to talking to one of them one day and said, I think you guys, and it really was mostly guys, you'd be interested in hearing how images are created up there at Pixar. Would you be willing to watch a presentation from Sharon Callahan?" They said, "Yes, we're curious, sure." And we brought down a special computer, some Silicon Graphics, something or other from the Finding Nemo vintage, early 2000s. And she presented a kind of progression using her tools on a big screen in the clubhouse at the great ASC. I would say about half the room was just completely enwrapped, like imagining where this could go and what the freedom was for someone who is creating lit imagery as they were used to doing, but with virtual tools. And then the other half of the room was like, "Why are we listening to this lady? I don't understand what we're doing here. What is this? This is not filmmaking." And so, this is what I mean by it shook people. They didn't know what to make of it, many of them. They couldn't see around that corner. Cut to, I don't know, it was probably 10 years later, 8 years later. Sharon was one of the, if not the first, digital cinematographers to become a member of the American Society of Cinematographers. So, we got there, and of course now the revolution is part of the institution, and Sharon Callahan is now Sharon Callahan ASC, and I'm so proud of that, and kind of just being there for the ride, was really just a remarkable moment to observe.
Earlier, Bobbie, I pointed out just how much of your time is put into celebrating the art of editing and talking to editors. Obviously, this book was a huge undertaking that you did with Bill. I'm kind of curious if along the way there was anything that stood out to you as, wow, I had no idea. This is a revelation to me.
So much of it. I just couldn't believe that I didn't understand the nature of the technology along with the culture and learning about the history, that this was at all possible. But I know that when you think about live action editors, they're triaging, they're salvaging. They can't go back and say, "I need this other shot. We have to go back to Dubai and, get all the actors together." I don't think so. And the beauty of being able to not only contribute at the storyboard stage, but just even like we were talking about virtual shooting, that they're on quote location scouts, and they can ask for shots if they don't have the coverage they need. They're collaborating with the cinematographer directly, which wouldn't happen, and actually getting results that are going to improve their edit, and I just had absolutely no idea that this was a possibility. And I just, as I said, it's the editor has so much to offer, and this was a world where they could really offer parts of their talents that I never thought was possible. And it just kept more and more, as we got more and more into the world, and I started interviewing all these editors, I just couldn't believe what they were talking about and how much, it's like what I was saying about Nick Smith's quote about the good news and the bad news. But this idea that you really can do anything and that you have the luxury of time. Obviously, not all animation films have the time and money that Pixar has, but you do have the luxury of manipulation, endless manipulation, and making mistakes and experimentation that you just couldn't do. And it's a combination of, it's a lot of it's digital editing, but it's also this, sound isn't tied to picture and all these. So you have this convergence of the nature of animation and the digital editing world, and that together they created almost endless possibilities for the editor to fully use all their talents and create great stories.
I liked what Bobbie just made an allusion to, which I want to elaborate on for a second, which is the idea that not every studio, not every project has the time and the money that Pixar has. And I've heard this before because I've had the privilege of working at a few places since my Pixar career, and they don't have the time and the money that Pixar had. And I say, use the approach in proportion. So maybe you don't have X $100,000, but you have X $1,000. So divide by 1,000 and use all that time, as Bobbie said, in the experimentation, in the storytelling, in the development of the characters, and the emotion of your story. Costs the least, actually, compared to all these fancy digital tools, building sets and everything. Like, get it right on pencil and paper first. Pay lots and lots of attention to the voices and the performance, which also is not the most expensive thing that you're going to do, as I can see your budget. And then you'll start to get quality in return. And it does work. I'm working on a animated television show right now, and I can see it's that superpower again that Bobbie alluded to. So much is happening with the editor on this project that is making things work.
And editors are incredibly resourceful and inventive. And, I just did a panel with about animation editing, and they were mostly not talking about Pixar films. And this woman, Stephanie Early, is working on a 2D TV series called Central Park. She does color, which is animation, and storyboard. She has 5 days to edit the storyboard. She doesn't have 2.5 years. But she's incredibly inventive because she has to repurpose things. They have so little time. She's repurposing animation. But, the thing that always comes down to the same thing. It's always about story. And don't make the mistake, even if you have very little money, get the story right at that early stage. Like Bill said, the pencil stage. Don't say, oh, we'll figure it out later. That's a terrible trap that a lot of young filmmakers make. You're not going to figure it out. It's the hardest thing.
Well, Bill, now that you've done both, what's harder, making an animated CGI feature or making a book about animated CGI feature filmmaking?
Wow. They're all hard.
Yes, that little talk barely scratched the surface of all that book offers. So get the book. There is a link in the show notes that will take you right to it, so you can continue your adventures with Bill and Bobbie into the world of film editing and animated features. Thank you. Yes, that's 3 thank yous to Bill and Bobbie for talking with us today and giving us the lowdown on making the cut at Pixar. Back when Pixar started, they could barely afford to have a media composer, says Bill. I don't know about that. What I do know is that was close to 30 years ago, God help me. And what I also know is that today, in 2022, you could absolutely afford a media composer of your very own for pennies a day. How many pennies depends on what version you get and whether or not you're a student. Student pricing is insanely good. I think we actually pay you, which is crazy. I can't live on that. But don't worry about me. Just go get started on your journey to editorial superstardom today. That omnipresent link is still right there in the show notes to take you to avid.com to help you on your way. And with that, our book club podcast has come to an end. I think next week we'll try something a little different as well. Possibly talk about indie filmmaking, which is always a worthwhile topic. I don't know. We'll see how that goes. Until then, my friend, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.